February 19th, 1944. Deep beneath the volcanic rock of Rabaul, on the island of New Britain, Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka sat inside his underground command bunker. The flickering light of a single oil lamp trembled against the concrete walls as he wrote in his private journal, words that, if ever discovered, could have cost him his life. "The Americans are not fighting us, they are strangling us," he wrote. Outside, the muffled thunder of B-24 Liberators rolled through the humid air. Those bombing raids had become so routine they were called the daily milk run. Yet what haunted Kusaka most was not the explosions, but the silence afterward, the realization that the Americans no longer cared to finish them off. 100,000 of Japan's best troops, engineers, gunners, aviators, were trapped inside the vast fortress of Rabaul. And yet the enemy had chosen to ignore them. The once feared bastion of the Japanese Empire had become irrelevant. For years, Tokyo's military planners believed that every island fortress would act as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, forcing the Americans to pay dearly for every stretch of sand. This was the so-called absolute defense zone, the line meant to stop any invasion toward the Japanese homeland. But that grand vision shattered when General Hitoshi Imamura's 50,000 men, along with hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and miles of tunnels, were simply left behind. The Americans never intended to storm Rabaul. They had chosen a new kind of war, one fought with time and starvation instead of bullets and bayonets. The warning signs had appeared months earlier. In mid-1943, U.S. forces bypassed heavily fortified islands, landing instead on Woodlark and Kiriwana, where Japanese resistance was light. Intelligence officers mocked the choice at first. "The enemy lacks the stomach for hard combat," one wrote. But as the campaign unfolded, that arrogance turned into confusion. The Americans weren't conquering, they were building. They seized small, flat islands where airfields could be constructed quickly, allowing them to leapfrog past Japanese strongholds entirely. Each new base became a stepping stone closer to Japan itself. On New Georgia, the pattern became unmistakable. The Americans fought ferociously for one airstrip and then stopped. They ignored thousands of Japanese troops still dug in nearby. One bitter survivor recalled, "The Americans fight differently. They take what they need and leave the rest. It is as if we do not exist." By late 1943, the Allies had launched Operation Cartwheel, the grand strategy to isolate Rabaul instead of destroy it. Japan's high command poured reinforcements into the base, even stripping aircraft from its dwindling carrier fleet. Veteran pilots who once struck Pearl Harbor now flew from Rabaul's airfields. But the Americans had already written Rabaul off. Carrier raids pounded the harbor, sinking ships and wiping out Japan's elite pilots in days. Then, silence. The enemy simply vanished beyond the horizon. One Japanese officer described the moment with despair. "We won, we drove them off, so why does it feel like we have lost?" The true weapon of the American strategy was time. Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omi, one of Rabaul's staff officers, documented the slow suffocation in precise numbers. In November 1943, the garrison received 30,000 tons of supplies per month. By December, it was down to 18,000 tons. By January, less than 2,000 tons, mostly delivered by submarines. By February 1944, Tokyo had effectively abandoned Rabaul. No aircraft, no fuel, no food. The fortress had become a prison. Disease spread faster than any enemy. By March, a third of the garrison suffered from malaria or dysentery. Food shortages forced ration cuts, and desperate soldiers began eating jungle roots and poisonous plants. By summer, General Imamura issued a humiliating order: Half of every soldier's day must now be devoted to farming. Entire regiments became farmers. Rice paddies replaced trenches. My samurai ancestors would weep to see us. We trained to die gloriously in battle. Now we raise chickens. And Rabaul was not alone. Across the Pacific, dozens of isolated garrisons suffered the same fate. At Wake Island, 4,000 Japanese troops waited for an invasion that never came. Their commanders begged Tokyo for help. Food situation critical. When will relief arrive? None ever did. In the Caroline Islands, Major General Kitamura despaired. We are not part of the decisive battle. We have become orphans. By mid-1944, most of his men were farming instead of fighting. Occasionally, Allied bombers returned, not to invade, but to remind them they were still trapped. At Truk Lagoon, once called Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, carrier strikes in February 1944 destroyed hundreds of planes and dozens of ships. But again, there was no invasion. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi wrote bitterly, "This is not warfare, it is torment." By the middle of 1944, the proud Imperial Army had transformed into scattered colonies of starving soldiers. Across the Pacific, more than 300,000 men sat stranded, fully armed, yet utterly powerless. Tokyo continued to send impossible orders, maintain readiness for offensive operations, but many garrisons hadn't seen a supply ship in half a year. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, thousands of men still held out, refusing to believe the war was over. Some fought for years afterward. The most famous, Hiro Onoda, didn't surrender until 1974, 29 years after peace. For Japan's warriors, America's island-hopping campaign was more than a tactical defeat. It was a psychological warfare. The Japanese code of Bushido glorified death in battle. To die fighting was the highest honor. To surrender was unthinkable. Yet the Americans denied them even that. Instead of annihilating them, the enemy ignored them. Instead of glorious death, there was starvation and decay. One intelligence officer summed it up with haunting precision. We were prepared for American strength. We were prepared for their technology. But we were not prepared for their indifference. Even Japan's most respected commanders saw what was coming. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who would later lead the defense of Iwo Jima, studied the fate of Rabaul and Wake Island closely. He knew the Americans would come for Iwo Jima eventually, and he knew they could not be stopped. But he resolved to make the price unbearable. His defenses ran deep underground, miles of tunnels and bunkers designed to bleed the Marines white. When the Americans landed in February 1945, his plan worked. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days, killing or wounding nearly 26,000 U.S. Marines. Kuribayashi's fortress became a symbol of resistance, yet his genius was born from hopelessness. Across the Pacific, bypassed fortresses withered. Disease, hunger, and despair replaced glory. Soldiers who had once shouted battle cries now whispered prayers for death. Private Kazuo Sakamaki, one of the survivors on a forgotten island, wrote, "We do not fear death, we fear meaninglessness." For men raised to die for the emperor, being left to rot in isolation was worse than defeat. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the architect of the American advance, later reflected, "Every bypassed island represented thousands of soldiers we didn't have to kill, and American lives we didn't have to lose." But even among Japan's highest ranks, the realization was devastating. Admiral Matome Ugaki, chief of staff of the Japanese fleet, confessed in his diary, The Americans have found the perfect weapon against us. They have made our courage irrelevant, our fortifications useless, our bushido meaningless. He concluded with words that echoed across Japan's shattered empire. We prepared to die gloriously. They condemned us to live shamefully. When the war finally ended, 69,000 Japanese soldiers surrendered at Rabaul without ever firing a shot. Across the Pacific, hundreds of thousands more laid down their arms on islands the Americans had never even bothered to invade. They had not been defeated in glorious battle. They had been erased, discarded by history's most efficient strategy. In his final journal entry, written days before Japan's surrender, Vice Admiral Kusaka captured the horror of what he had witnessed. The Americans have taught us the cruelest lesson, that there is something worse than death in battle, irrelevance in defeat. That was the hidden genius of island hopping. It wasn't the battles the Americans fought, it was the ones they refused to fight. By turning Japan's strengths into weaknesses, by transforming fortresses into prisons and warriors into farmers, the Allies created a new form of warfare, one that crushed an empire not through destruction, but through abandonment. And for the soldiers of the rising sun, men who had been raised to die with honor, that quiet, suffocating irrelevance was the most terrifying fate of all.